We started this series on intelligence last year, but we've brought in intelligence professionals and others concerned about national security to discuss not only how intelligence really works, but its impact on humans, on people. Our program emphasizes American intelligence, and this means we ask questions, such as, are U.S. intelligence activities conducted in accordance with American values and with moral standards that the American people are comfortable with? We've asked these questions in previous events dealing with the general question of ethics in intelligence, the specific question of ethics in technical collection of intelligence, and U.S. intelligence activities following 9/11 and the War on Terror. For this fourth event, we turn to the subject of espionage. Before we do that, and before I introduce our guests, we have to define our terms, okay? Espionage is not a synonym for intelligence, which is a broad range of activities. It's not even a synonym for intelligence collection, most of which is done by technical means. For our purposes this evening, we define espionage as a particular form of human intelligence involving a U.S. intelligence officer, traditionally called a case officer. These are all former case officers. And a foreigner who has access to information of interest to the United States and who has agreed to provide that information to the United States through that case officer. At the core of espionage, then, is a relationship between the case officer and that foreigner, who is variously called an asset, a foreign reporting asset, an agent, a clandestine source. Other terms are used. He or she is a spy for the United States. With this relationship, it doesn't just happen. There is a process called the recruitment cycle or the asset acquisition cycle that starts with identifying an individual in a foreign country who might have information relevant to U.S. national security. As my students know, this is called spotting. It's the first stage. Then CIA does research on that individual. This is the assessment stage. And if that assessment determines that this individual might make a productive asset, then a case officer will try to start a relationship and establish a relationship with that individual. This is the development stage. A relationship is being developed, but the prospective asset doesn't know yet. In most cases, he's being developed for the next stage, which is recruitment, or simply the pitch. A case officer makes the pitch. If the recruitment is successful, the new asset starts his or her clandestine work, provides information to his case officer, and receives compensation from the case officer. This is the maintenance or handling stage, and it's where the relationship is in full bloom, fully at work. Because nothing lasts forever, at some point, the last stage will come, which is termination. It's not as ominous as Hollywood wants you to think. It's simply the ending of a relationship, usually on good terms. I hope we can discuss the humanity of espionage at every one of these stages. Helping us with these issues is what I have to say is a hall of fame of former CIA case officers, all of whom have worked as case officers or managers and managers of case officers. Their professional experience is diverse. These four dealt with espionage cases across the globe. Beginning with John Bennett. John, would you raise your hand so people know who you are? He is the former director of the National Clandestine Service at the CIA. He has 33 years experience as an operations officer and manager. He served 18 years overseas, mostly in Africa, including 4 tours as CIA Chief of Station. Later, he managed counterterrorism operations in Southwest Asia. Mr. Bennett has degrees from Harvard and Georgetown and is a former Marine Corps infantry officer. Juan Cruz served as Chief of Station in 4 different overseas locations and later was in charge of the agency's Latin America division. In addition to espionage, he has experience in counterinsurgency and covert action operations. His degrees are from Georgetown and Johns Hopkins, and he also studied at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. Most recently, Mr. Cruz served on the National Security Council. as special advisor to President Trump and senior director for the Western Hemisphere. Gil Kindelman started out as a TV journalist and then went into government service, ending up with 34 years of service, first in the US Army and then mostly in CIA. He served overseas for 17 years of his CIA career in Asia, in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, in Western Europe and the Middle East as a case officer, deputy chief of station, and chief of station. He was also chief of staff for the Counterterrorism Center. Scotty Skotzko served 40 years in CIA operations with 8 overseas postings in the Balkans, South Asia, and Africa. He had senior management positions at headquarters and several deployments supporting US military operations in Somalia, Kosovo, Iraq, Qatar, and Afghanistan. At one point, he was the boss of a young CIA officer named Gina Haspel, who's now the CIA director. Scotty was a colleague of mine at CIA's Center for the Study of Intelligence, where he wrote valuable case studies on subjects I'm not allowed to tell you. He is a graduate of Franklin and Marshall College and Columbia University. So, in addition to being spy handlers, these are gentlemen and scholars. So I'm going to move from this position to my moderator's position over here.
Since the subject here is humanity and morality in espionage, it might be useful to start first with some observations about case officers and what it is they do. They are the ones, after all, who deal with those agents, with those sources, and they deal with them almost always on a one-to-one basis. So what is a case officer? My definition of a case officer is that he's a professional opportunist. And don't take that the wrong way. I don't intend that to degrade what they do. He's a professional opportunist who is real good at recognizing potential opportunities when they cross his path, jumping on those opportunities and making something of them. It means he's always trolling. He's always trolling, assessing vulnerabilities. He's looking for common ground on which he can operate with somebody. You do this, you find this common ground by trying to establish a relationship with somebody, sustain that relationship, maintain that discourse with them, and you're looking for converging interests. Where do your interests converge with the target's interest? And when you find that convergence, now you have common ground, because you're always looking for common ground. Once you discover common ground, now you try to expand that so that you can do something on the basis of that common ground. The essential core then of what a case officer does is involves manipulation and exploitation. Now that too has a pejorative connotation in popular usage, but I don't intend it that way at all here. You are looking for self-ideation and self-fulfillment on the part of the target that you're talking with. You want to find out what that is, what that self-ideation and self-fulfillment is in that person's mind. There's no formula to this. It's a prolonged process. It's a process of helping them to find purpose, consciously or unconsciously, purpose in doing what you want them to do. It involves building a trust relationship, which you'll hear a lot more about as we go around the panel. As a rule, this does not involve coercion. We're not into coercion for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about later. It does sometimes mean that you need to help the target understand where his best interests lie. Now, I want to read to you what several practitioners have written about this business of exploiting self-ideation and providing self-fulfillment. From the KGB, a very famous officer, senior officer, General Pavel Sudoplatov, wrote a book called Special Tasks. He had a nasty background. He was responsible for the assassination of Trotsky, responsible for the assassination of Ukrainian immigrant leader Konovalets in Rotterdam, several others. But in his book, he wrote, he used to advise KGB officers the following way: search for people who are hurt by fate or nature, the ugly, those suffering from an inferiority complex, craving power and influence, but defeated by unfavorable circumstances. In cooperation with us, then, all these find a peculiar compensation. The sense of belonging to an influential and powerful organization will give them a feeling of superiority over the handsome and prosperous people around them. In other words, it's giving them something they didn't have. KGB, by the way, used the acronym MICE, stood for money, ideology, coercion, and ego. Second practitioner you should be aware of, Marcus Wolf, headed the HVA, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the East German Stasi, wrote a book called Man Without a Face. And when he was writing about why the Stasi did not have to use Gestapo methods when they were interrogating a suspected mole, he wrote this: the East German method was based on psychological pressure against men and women accustomed to drawing their sense of identity and self-esteem from membership in a group of like-minded people. When that trust is suddenly withdrawn, the psychological pressure on them becomes acute. There was no need to threaten them. Now, both Sudoplatov and Wolf are describing the same psychological phenomenon, the importance of to an individual of their sense of self-worth. Sudoplatov offers them fulfillment. Wolf offered them redemption. The third one I wanted to read to you was, compare what Avi Dagan says. Avi Dagan, former head of asset recruitment for Mossad, who described the recruitment dynamic in this way: promise to help them achieve something they want. Then, if they discover that it's a scam, it's too late to back out. Now, cynicism aside, all three of these guys are describing the same phenomenon. So the case officer's task then is uncovering and exploiting the target's self-ideation, helping them to fulfill those purposes that are most important to them.
It's a dishonorable activity, espionage, but we do it in an honorable fashion. And as what Scotty was talking about, the Russians and the East Germans, those are methods and techniques that we, I think, use a softer approach to that. And my experience is much similar to what it was as a junior journalist. And I had some very good teachers who were very ethical about the journalism profession and how you treated your sources and how you protected them and how you built trust with them and so forth. And those were some of the characteristics that I felt also fit very well with what I was doing as a case officer. And that was the key thing. Without that personal connection, very seldom people can see through you if you don't have that personal connection with them. And sometimes you have a personal connection with somebody and it doesn't go where you want it to go, but you still have a nice personal connection. And other times you run into people who are more unsavory, and you have to swallow your pride and to get to know them a little bit. And when you get past the outside shell, you find out that they're just human beings, most of them too, and you do find something in common with them in order to do what, work on a relationship and build it toward that. But I think of it as you're thinking about what the total goal was. And when I started, it was basically with the Russians were the only people out there who could kill us. And it was a very, very intensive operational aspect going after Russian targets and East Europeans at the time as well. And you had to try to build that relationship. Sometimes they would volunteer to you. Oh, I've been waiting to meet you. I've been waiting to meet an American. In other cases, that doesn't happen very often, by the way. On the other hand, you would spend time, and you may spend 3 or 4 years working on someone, meeting them, massaging them, having a good relationship with them, and then you leave, or they leave, and it's left then to Scotty or John or Juan on their tours, and maybe 10 years down the road, believe it or not, that person might be recruited because of the relationships that we created with them over those years. And there's the personal aspect of it, I think, to me, is the part I enjoyed the most, and I must say I found it very difficult sometimes having to work with people who I just couldn't get a handle on. I just couldn't feel close enough to that I could develop a relationship with him. So.
We're going to bounce over to John and your thoughts general thoughts on this matter.
Yeah. First of all, Nick, you're very generous in describing me as a scholar. Maybe my colleagues were, but anyone who had ever seen my transcripts would dispute that. And I don't even know what self-iteration is, Scotty. So ideation. So there's the proof. One of my former mentors and former DDO described what we do as recruit spies, steal secrets. I give a larger presentation at other occasions that I call Shades of Gray, and that's because espionage is in the gray. It's full of moral ambiguities, and if you're a person who sees the world in terms of black and white, that probably isn't the career for you. Nick did a very good job of going through the agent acquisition cycle as it's taught. That's sort of a sterile academic description. How does that translate in the real world in the street for the case officer? It's about deception, manipulation, and I'm a little darker than most of my colleagues on this, ultimately corruption, and not necessarily money, because although that's part of it. But you start the relationship based on deception, cover, misrepresenting who you are and what you want. You then develop the relationship with the objective of leading this person, who may never even thought of it, down the path of a criminal conspiracy to commit treason. And if the recruitment is successful and he enters into that relationship, there's a degree of moral corruption there. I consider betrayal a corrupt act. Now, they have different reasons for doing it, but at its base, the betrayal is a corrupt act. You're asking them to do something that hopefully you would never do yourself or even entertain thinking about. So there's a lot of ambiguities there. There's a lot of gray areas that you have to come to terms with. And there's a paradox. And the paradox is that this relationship that is initiated on the basis of deception and manipulation then has to become one of absolute trust. That agent is putting his liberty, if not his life, in the hands of the case officer. And you, conversely, are putting your security in his hands. If he's a double agent who's going to sell you out to the security service, is he somebody who's indiscreet or who won't follow the guidance you give him on tradecraft and is likely to compromise the whole operation? And if you're in Russia, you may spend a couple uncomfortable nights at Lubyanka, but probably within 72 hours you're going to get a business class ticket home, persona non grata. If you're dealing with terrorists, or as Juan has, narco-traffickers, or the Iranians, they may not respect your diplomatic immunity quite the way that the Soviet Union would. So you have to have a relationship of trust with the agent. They have to trust you. And that's a paradox, given the way the relationship often starts. The second issue, which is, I think, a more strategic issue, which our officers don't often ask themselves, but managers, senior managers, need to ask is, who do we spy on? Who do we use this tool of espionage with all its moral ambiguities against? Obviously, a rival superpower like the Russians or today the Chinese. But what about our allies, our friends? We spy on them. What about countries in Latin America or Africa that really don't pose a threat to the United States? Should we be spying on them? So those are the kind of questions that need to be asked. Excuse me. I will end with a quote from actually a novelist, not being as well read as Scotty. John le Carré in 1991 in his book, The Secret Pilgrim. Le Carré, is hero George Smiley, is retired, and like us, he's lecturing at their training school, and he describes the service, what they're going out to do, as good men in bad countries. And I think that's very much still a valid construct. We have a lot of good men and women today in some very bad places, and every day they're in that gray area of trying to work their way through the ambiguities that are the essence of espionage.
Le Carre also wrote someplace that intelligence is a reflection of a nation's subconscious. I'm not sure what he
Yeah,
meant.
that, he wrote that. That was actually in Tinker Tailor, and it was the traitor Bill Hayden who said that intelligence reflects the true character of a country.
So Juan, what did you see in the area of gray?
Good evening, Nick, and thank you and for the Institute of Human Ecology for having us this evening. I think one of the challenges for me is I think they made a mistake to put me on stage with these intelligence giants, and I'm just going to try to play to catch up or to keep up with them. We're going to have fun this evening, I think, because we all come from it on the subject with a different approach. And for me, I've always seen the job of a case officer to be a privilege. And in its purest form, it's a relationship between two people that have to engage in mutual trust. This is a covenant, not unlike a marriage. And it's with all the highs and lows of a marriage is a relationship. This is one that you can't afford betrayal, but it can happen. And you have to sometimes mend those relationships. But it's also a bond forged of hardship, often hardship, risk, but for a greater good. And a case officer has the challenge of playing multiple roles. Well, of course, you're an intelligence collector and you're a handler of this agent, of this asset. And in the U.S., we use the term asset. That alone tells you a lot. Asset is something that adds value. If you're a good case officer doing your job, you're a teacher and maybe you're a student. You're there to train. You're there to be a shoulder to cry on, a father confessor, a coaxer, a reporter, and if you're lucky, to be a friend. And we've all had the opportunity to do all those things and more with individuals who've entrusted their well-being, their safety, and their lives to you. And an enormous responsibility to all of us up here. And it's one of those that it's really easy to get up in the morning if that's what your job is, right? It's one of the best jobs there is. You get up in the morning and you're playing, maybe in this meeting you planned to obtain some critical piece of information, but you ended up being an amateur psychologist because that's what your asset needed that day. They didn't need you to go out and debrief the hell out of them. What they needed was for you to show human compassion and for a need and for a purpose that you would be able to take advantage of later on because you showed a human side to what the United States is. It is a reflection of who we are as a nation. And I've always felt that I never looked back and had any sort of issue with the kind of work I did. In the area of morality, I thought the challenges could be many, but I would like to take it down to a very granular optic for you that maybe is when you have a source in front of you, that source demands the very best of you and what you've said that you're going to do to protect their identity and their well-being. And a note of a personal note, I was once challenged in this way, found myself with vital information that a source in a narcotics trafficking organization very high up, the source is actually in the family, not in the organization, provided this information, and the information was poorly handled within the U.S. government by another agency. And everything indicated that probably the organization could have had access to this information. Only a handful of people could have provided it. So my message from headquarters was, you need to tell her. You need to tell her, and we're prepared to resettle her in the United States if she chooses. I've got to be honest with you, that's not a message that I wanted to deliver. Not only because she was tougher than nails, and I thought, maybe she'd hurt me, but also because it was a broach. I broke my agreement to her. I said we would safeguard her information, and it would be tightly held. And it would have been easy for me to compromise myself and tell headquarters that I had told her. and that would have been the wrong thing. And I could have rolled that message up with so much bubble wrap that she really didn't get what I was saying. And I knew that I owed her the truth, unvarnished as it was. And I'll tell you, she gave me a shellacking. She scraped the barnacles right off my hull. And I deserved it because I represent this nation. And in the end, the relationship changed, right? Because I went from a person totally in control of the relationship to someone who was in a different kind of partnership. But I thought I'd use it as a footnote on some of the ethics that we could be confronted just as a regular case officer on the ground.
Very good, thank you. So we're talking about the stages before the actual recruitment where, you know, the scales fall from the asset's eyes and he or she knows exactly what's going on. But when you as a case officer are doing the spotting, the assessing, and then trying to develop that relationship, you're looking at these human factors, some would call them vulnerabilities. And the question then is, are we cynically exploiting human weaknesses, treating people solely as a means to an end, or are we doing better than that? Are we treating them not as complete ends in themselves, but something in between a means and an end? What do you think about that?
Well, I think absolutely there's an in-between. You recognize somebody who has access to the information you want, and you have to build a relationship. I can just do an anecdote for one of the cases I had earlier in my career. Was a military officer in a very poor African country. His son was dying of parasites. I mean, the kid was being fed the deworming medicine they give to cattle, and he was gradually dying. And he wasn't recruited at this point, he was just a contact. And I was able to bring in an agency doctor who pretty quickly, with the right antibiotics, cleared this up. And that individual was very grateful. In his mind, not incorrectly, the CIA and specifically me had saved his son's life. So when he came back and said, you know, I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Is there anything I can ever do for you? I said, well, now that you ask, yeah, there's a few things I'd be interested in knowing. And he was, of course, more than happy to help and always felt indebted. He didn't feel, later on, he did get a modest salary because he wasn't being very well paid. But the fact is that we had helped his family and done something very important to him. It wasn't exploitative. His quid pro quo, providing the information to the United States, was something he felt indebted to do. And in fact, his own government and his own army had not been able to help him in any way. We were the only ones who had shown any interest in saving his son or providing treatment. So I never felt bad about that. I never felt exploitative about that case.
Others with another experience there? I mean,
I imagine there are people asking themselves now, well, how can you do what is morally corrupt? You're corrupting people, aren't you? And in one sense, yes, we do. But I need to remind people sometimes that if you're expecting moral equivalency, you're in the wrong line of work. If you're expecting moral equivalency, you're in the wrong line of work. You're not going to find it in this line of work. You simply have to tell yourself that it's like being in war, in the military, in time of war. You're right, they're wrong, and God's on your side. And leave it at that, because you'll never resolve the ambiguities and the moral contradictions in this. You have to live with that. If you can't live with that, then find something else to do. There is, however, and maybe this will lead to the next phase, the issue of keeping faith with our assets, with our agents. It's been referred to several times now. We go to extraordinary lengths to do that. If they get sick, we try to help them. If they need finances, we try to help them. we have gone used extraordinary measures to free them from imprisonment. And there are at least 3 such cases that I know of right now, where, and Juan's aware of one of them, where people have spent multiple years in prison, and we have been able to negotiate one way or another to free them. There was one individual who I was familiar with who was in the hospital. He was comatose. We knew that he had been compromised because of what he had been carrying with him, and we decided we knew he didn't have any money. We were going to try to get some money to him, and we were about to send somebody in to posing as an old friend and colleague to pass him a large sum of money, and we found out at the last minute this was all a setup. We would have walked right into that trap. But we had been prepared. We had been thinking about trying to do the right thing by that person. So we do try to keep the faith. It's not all moral corruption.
So the case officer makes the pitch, and it's successful. You've persuaded this individual to break the trust he has with his own country in order to gain privileged information that he has access to. And I'm interested in, how does the relationship change at that moment? You've developed a relationship, as John has said, under false pretenses. The scales fall from the eyes. Does the asset feel like he or she has been used? You know, you said you loved me, but you just wanted to get in bed with me. How does the relationship change with the pitch? Gil?
Well, you know, I think there's something that when we do when we're doing that development phase and the assessment phase, there's something about that person that leads us to believe that when we get to that stage, that they're likely to say yes. Yeah. And so you have to have the timing just right to ask them. And in many cases, they'll say, what took you so long? Yeah. You know, what have you been waiting for? And you can't say, well, I had to wait till headquarters made a decision and we could work all these things out and everything else. But you say, well, you know, I'm sorry, I was busy or something like that. But there is, and many times they come in, then all of a sudden sometimes they try to take command of the meeting and say, well, now that we're on this kind of relationship, this is what I want, you know, all these things. So just calm down, let's take this a step at a time. You know, first of all, we've got to make sure that this relationship is secure, that we don't broadcast to the world that we have this different kind of relationship. And then you start building those factors into the relationship. You start talking about what they're prepared to give to you and what they're prepared to talk about. Intelligence officers particularly are the most difficult in some ways because invariably they'll talk about anybody's operations but their own. And eventually you have to say, look, your management, if it comes out that you're working with us, that you're cooperating with us, they're going to figure you gave us the whole thing anyway, so why not tell us everything? But they want to protect their own agents. And but on other people, you know, there are sometimes guidelines which they won't cross. We'll talk about this kind of topic, but I won't talk about personalities. I'll give you intel about what's going on in the government or in my department or in the military, but I'm not going to give you the details. In other words, they're not going to give us assessment data on other potential targets that we may be interested in. Over time, if you build a relationship with the individual, they come to trust you. They know that you're behind them, that you have their security in mind, that you're protecting them. And then gradually those things will begin to come out as you raise them. So.
That's a great point, because oftentimes you secure their cooperation in one area knowing that they're reluctant to provide information in another area, but over time, as you discussed, you win their confidence, and our professionalism opens that door. I want to touch upon something on recruitment, because recruitments are actually pretty tough. And there was a lot of nodding of heads up here on the stage when we talked about when you recruit someone, you know they're going to say yes, or you better know they're going to say yes. So it's not something like you're flipping a coin or something like that. Having said that, I'd like to share in my first recruitment, I was so nervous that I actually pitched the guy 3 times. I said, this is what I need for you to do, in other words. And so, I unrolled it, and then I said, what I mean is, and he had to stop me. He said, no, I got you the first time. He says, we're good.
I'm sure you hadn't done this before.
Same thing with termination. When you end this relationship, and all relationships end at some point, it has to be done as professionally with as much care and attention to detail as a recruitment. And you should know how the termination is going to go, just like you should know how the recruitment is going to go. And I'll just add one point on the issue of cover and how the relationship may or may not change. And it's really, there are nuances there. You often won't have to necessarily drop cover. Some assets don't want to know who you work for. They feel more comfortable. You want to obfuscate. It's unimportant to them because they want to work for you, whoever you work for, because their trust is in you and you've developed that trust with them. And quite frankly, I never had anyone straight out ask me who I worked for. They either already supposed, knew, guessed, or they didn't care.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize when you talk about the recruitment and the handling and the relationships that there's a range of reasons that people agree to spy. And some of them are ideologues who sincerely believe that it's in the best interest of their country to cooperate with the United States, the world's leading democracy and superpower, and they can be a pleasure to work with. There's others who are totally transactional. They could care less as long as the money's on the table every month, and they will make increasing demands for the money. And they'll realize what their information may be worth, and one of the reasons they hold back is to extort a little more money on in the meeting that month. And I had agents who, after you were done meeting with them, you felt like you needed to take a hot shower. They were so sleazy. But it was a very transactional relationship. And then there's people who are almost sociopathic. They are doing it to get even with their boss, to get even with the system. It's to inflict pain on something that they feel has wronged them. I think the KGB touched on that in how he described the potential agent. I mean, we had one case, I think it comes to mind, who was a KGB defector, and he was angry with his wife specifically. And when we asked about exfilling the family when he defected, he was only interested in getting his dog out. He said, can you exfiltrate my dog? He was not interested in getting his wife out at all. And, that's not uncommon. I think Robert Hansen, the FBI trader, I think he was a sociopath in that sense. I think Rick Ames was probably more transactional. He had some needs for a very high-end spouse, and he was willing to sell some of the most sensitive information we had and sell out to their death a number of our agents, and that was largely for the money. Ames certainly was not a Marxist. It wasn't an ideologue. He was somewhere between transactional and sociopathic.
It was, So I'm interested in rules of engagement. When you're making the pitch and then maintaining the relationship, are there red lines that you won't cross, either ethically, morally, operationally, without getting into any secrets about training? What's in your toolkit as a case officer?
Well, I would say up front, for absolutely a red line is an intimate sexual relationship with an asset. Whether you're a male or a female, and the presumption that some of our female case officers, their agents may presume, especially in the early phase of the developmental, that the woman is coming on to them, that is an absolute red line. We don't expect our officers to do that, and if they do that and we find out about it, there's going to be a serious disciplinary action for them for that. That's totally unprofessional.
I think our experience has been, however, with our female officers, case officers, they are very able to take care of themselves when it comes to this. They have no problem, a lot more so than a male in comparable situation. They are very capable of saying no, unless they don't want to say no. That has perhaps happened occasionally, but no, we've not, as a rule, had a problem.
I think Scotty, I think that they're very capable of taking care of themselves and saying no.
Right.
I don't think they come back to male supervisors very often and share those problems. Most of them, they may complain to other women about a given agent being too forward, but they're very unlikely, because their concern is that then we'll take them off the case and assign a male to handle the guy.
I'd say probably in the area of compensation. We've touched on this earlier. Compensation doesn't have to take the form of money, especially in other days and before the internet. It could be access to certain books. It could be collections. It could be something really of value to them. It could be medical treatment. Whole compensation comes in all forms, and many folk who want to work for us because they're pro-U.S. or patriotic or believe in what we're doing are reluctant to accept compensation. But I would say in the red line area there are things that we won't get for you for a number of reasons. We give you a salary. If you want to get that on your own, that's your issue and your problem. But I think that's
Right.
But there are also levels of recruitment. Excuse me. There was a time where there were certain countries that we just couldn't offer them enough money for them to do it. And so you really had a personal relationship. The person knew who you were. They were doing what you wanted them to do, introducing you to people, setting up parties, telling you things, and the words were never spoken. Yet we were getting what we wanted without stepping over that line that would cause them, to say, that's not good. Our governments wouldn't agree to this. And there's always that level. There's various levels, and as I said before, started to say, some people come in with their list once they're on board, the transactional ones, and then you really, that starts to draw away from the relationship because they become an administrative handling problem, and you can't get to what you really want to get to. But there are various levels of recruitment. Sometimes you're not paying them at all. Some people have said, I don't want any money. I don't want to, that to me, I don't work for you. We work together. I don't want to be paid. But they may accept a gift, a very expensive gift. They may accept a ticket for a play or a ticket to go on vacation or something like that. But to actually have a salary where you say, okay, here's your 500 euros or 1,000 euros, sign here. That's not, that doesn't get into it. They don't want that. They want to keep that kind of fig leaf that this is a personal, professional, cooperative arrangement.
I think my favorite transactional was an African agent, though, he said, I want a Mercedes. And said, no, we're not giving you a Mercedes. And we were meeting in my vehicle, which was like a Peugeot 504 or something. And he said, well, I want a car like this. I said, no, you're not getting any car. He looked at me and said, okay, how about a bicycle?
I was just going to raise the bicycle then. Done. We once managed to get the cooperation of a chief of state, and all he wanted was a bicycle. He was happy. That's all he needed. He needed to distribute his party propaganda. So I'll give you two examples of the kind of thing we commonly do, and one example of what we almost never do. First of all, let me say, red lines.
Scotty.
Red lines. One of the red lines obviously involves any use of lethal force. We're not going to get involved in that. Getting rid of an enemy, getting rid of a spouse, getting rid of a boss, a terrorist act of any sort. We're not going to play that game. But kind of thing we do commonly is, one time I found myself negotiating, and that's what it was a salary negotiation, with a chief of one of the intelligence services that I was dealing with. And what he was interested in is getting me to pay for his son's college education in the U.S. And we went back and forth for a long time. Ate a number of meals together as we negotiated. And I had to get the message across to him, we're not in a charity business. We're not going to pay for your kid's education just because it would be nice. We got to get something in return. Eventually, he got the message and agreed. Similarly, I was dealing with an individual one time who approached me on behalf of somebody else who was working in an intelligence service. And he had a stack of classified documents in his hands that he wanted to pass me. But he wanted money for the other guy who had provided the documents. I said, well, I don't know who the other guy is. Who is it? Well, he wouldn't tell me. I said, well, that's not good enough. First of all, I don't know whether these documents are real or fabricated. Secondly, you won't tell me who's the origin of these documents. You're just going to have to bring me something more. I'll see you in 1 week. But you've got to bring me something that's a showstopper. You haven't given me a showstopper now. Well, he had no idea what that term meant, so I had to explain that to him. Eventually, he provided the showstopper, and that case went very, very nicely. Kind of thing that we do not do, but which the Russians, the Soviets, and others did commonly, East Germans did commonly. Blackmail. There was an American Foreign Service officer of ambassadorial rank who was of Eastern European origin. He had been in Ukraine during the war. He had been a teenager, and there had been some degree of cooperation with the German army. Don't know how much. Well, the Soviets had photos of this that they had dug up. And one time, this individual happened to travel to Ukraine, and the Soviets confronted him in his hotel room and showed him the photographs of him in some sort of it wasn't a Nazi uniform, but something that indicated he was perhaps working for an Einsatzgruppen, and said, you either cooperate with us or these get publicized and your career is at an end. Well, he didn't. He got on the next plane home, badly rattled, badly shaken, got out of the country without any problem and did the right thing and reported it. But it did cast a pall over his personal feelings, over his psychological state of mind, and over his career to some degree. We don't get involved in that kind of thing, in large measure because you're not sure what's going to come out of it in the end. You can't control what the psychological fallout is from that.
In researching espionage cases, I've been struck by the labor-intensive operational tradecraft and philosophy that the safety of the asset comes first, the security of the asset. But sometimes the asset doesn't seem to be as interested in his own security as you, the case officer, are. What do you do when you've got an asset who's reckless and for his own, too reckless for his own safety?
I think part of that depends on how valuable the information is and how important the asset is. The asset's safety is important, almost always the most important thing, but sometimes you will take risks with an asset if the situation requires that you meet them on an unscheduled basis, or there's a crisis going on and you need to see him. And if the asset is not that important and he's risking himself or risking the security of his case officer and risking a flap, well, you would end that relationship. Say, this guy's just not real spy material. But if his access is good enough, sometimes you have to make, and these are the morally ambiguous decisions, to run that case until he burns himself, because the information is that important.
And we had that situation quite often in the Cold War,
Yeah.
where you'd recruit someone in the West, and you would do some training to see if they would be suitable for handling when they went home. And you found out very quickly sometimes that yeah, they provided great intel, but this was not somebody you wanted to risk having a meeting with on a street in Moscow or somewhere else, because they just didn't get that aspect of the intelligence relationship. So you more or less sent them home and said, next time you come out, call us and we'll meet with you. And in one case, the FBI was videotaping the guy on the street, and it was a laugh a minute, and him doing things and then standing back and looking to see if he'd done it right and everything. I mean, it was pathetic. And we decided, the guy's very valuable. We're not going to take the chance on handling him inside. And even people that we handled inside. One of the features of the Kuklinski case, which Nick has brought up, was that early on he appeared at a meeting. It wasn't really a meeting as such, but he appeared at a point where he was going to see the case officer wearing his uniform. And this was not something that you would want your agent to come to a meeting in his uniform, or so that you'd say, oh, there's a foreigner meeting one of our local military officers in the woods somewhere. It's not good form.
There's only two conclusions you can draw, and neither is good.
And so sometimes even with people who are have potentially good information and do know a little bit about the security situation, will do things which are not good for them or for you. But the case officer is always responsible for the security of the agent. And that's sometimes very hard to get across to agents. They think that they're the local and they can get away with this and they can get away with that. And they don't think about who might be watching them or who might be concerned. And sometimes we've lost valuable cases, not because of breakdown in tradecraft, but because the guy was having an affair with his boss's wife and he didn't bother to tell us. And the bosses start sending people out to follow him, and they catch him, and then they search his house and they find interesting things, and poof, there goes the operation. And you can't predict everything.
A lot of the discussion here so far has been in the context of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Post 9/11, and I had senior positions both in the field and at headquarters, we changed the paradigm a little bit when it came to Al-Qaeda and to some of the CT cases. We were, I think, much more prepared to take some risks with our assets because the consequences and the importance of the intelligence was such that we couldn't justify protecting an asset if it meant an attack on Americans in Afghanistan or on the homeland or somewhere. So the moral equation was a little different than what it was, during the Cold War. It's tough. It's tough. Well, I had, case officers in my station in Pakistan. One of them lost 3 agents, and in the Cold War, that would have been just totally unacceptable. In that environment, it was almost, it wasn't, you didn't take it in a cavalier manner, but you recognized it was a war and that there were going to be casualties, and some of them were going to be our assets.
I'd like to take the discussion back to something that Nick said, because during the assessment and developmental phases are precisely when you look at some of the aspects that were raised here. When you're assessing this individual for their suitability for clandestine work, it's first of all, you're looking, of course, for access, right? That they have access to the privileged information that we can't otherwise get. But once you get past that stage, you have to think, is this person capable of being clandestine? We all know folk who, no matter what, could never be clandestine, right? Couldn't conduct a clandestine act. Is this person reliable? Can they, is it someone that you would let, take care of your, pets, your kids, Is this a person who can make it on time? Is this a person who knows how to report? And this falls into sort of the ethical piece. I actually picked up a source who was very well placed, was a vice minister in a country, but had been a sub-source. That is, this person had reported to the source. We didn't have direct contact. And this case officer, quite frankly, in an easy recruitment, decided to cut out the principal asset and then directly handle the sub-source. This person had great access, but was a really miserable reporter. No attention to detail, came with no notes, couldn't remember if it happened on Tuesday or Wednesday, couldn't remember if it was the South Koreans or the North Koreans. In our line of work, the first thing we do is we look at that and our counterintelligence antenna goes up, right? We're trying to sift, where's this coming from? And quite frankly, this person was simply a lousy asset. And the principal asset had found a way to debrief this person appropriately. But this person, I ended up actually reversing the relationship and putting that person under the principal asset again because it was a tremendous waste of my time.
Yeah, I mean, you get into the question with assets, are they telling you what they know to be a fact, or are they telling you what they think? You know, is it commentary? And a lot of them, especially if they're more senior, they think that their views on the world stage should be conveyed directly to the President of the United States, even if they're not based on any facts. And so the case officer has to sort of parse that out. Or if the case officer's not capable of it, reports officers and analysts have to parse it out at the other end.
The problem we frequently run into is that a lot of agents think that they know better than we do about how to operate on their local turf, their local environment. They're natives of that country or that city, and they will tell you, no, you're here for a couple of years, and then you go, I've been living here. I know what I can get away with here. I know what the service is. What they don't realize is just how much we do know over the years, the knowledge we have acquired through a variety of ways about the local counterintelligence threat. Now, I will give you one slightly humorous moral dilemma, and you tell me what you would do. We had one agent one time that had been running for a number of years, good producer, no problems, and there came a point where he was given a technical device, radio of some kind, so that he could communicate with us on a real-time basis. And his question to the case officer, honest to goodness, was, this is great. Can I talk to St. Peter with this? And he wasn't kidding. This guy was a very serious, committed Christian. And when he asked, can I use this to talk to St. Peter, he wasn't just joking.
The answer is
yes. What do you do? Huh?
The answer is yes.
All right.
He's not going to talk back.
You
can't talk to him.
So what do you do in that situation? Do you say, oh boy, the cuckooberry birds are in the tree, do we close this down?
Well, we know what Juan would do.
The answer is yes.
So you run into things like that sometimes.
Because of the security risk, the real risk of being caught, many of our assets, well, it's not a perception, it's the reality of the danger creates stress. And you don't want that stress to affect the productivity of the relationship. And I was thinking, Gil, that you were involved in a case, the Kuklinski case, where there was a profound human connection with a productive asset who felt himself in a untenable situation sometimes. He was on the Polish General Staff reporting to the United States on Warsaw Pact activities and plans. And what did we do for Kuklinski in that case?
Well, it's what he was telling us. I mean, he was very open to us in his communications so that we would know these things were going on. Sometimes you don't know what's really going on in the agent's life, and that's one of the things, like I was talking about the fellow having the affair with his boss's wife. Kuklinski was very much involved in the relationship. He had 2 relationships that were key to the whole operation over 10 years. One of them was with Dave Forden, who was one of the first case officers he met, the first CIA case officer he met. The other officers had been under military cover, and so Dave was the first CIA officer. And because of the relationship they established, Dave played a part in that operation for 10 years, which is very unusual. And it was through letters that he would write. And there were no personal meetings with Kuklinski after the first 2 years. So for seven or 8 years, all of the communications with him were by notes back and forth. And he became also friends in writing with his pen pal, who was the translator, because then they could understand each other's styles in reading. And every year or twice a year or something like that, Dave would write a message to Kuklinski to keep that basic relationship that they had established. And so he would share things with us. I can remember one time he wrote in and said, I almost walked up to somebody, I almost walked up to the wrong person. And he said, I'm afraid that they're not going right. And so those are the kinds of things where you tell him, okay, let's just calm down for a while, you settle back, we'll keep out of contact for a few months. And other times he would be worried, he would tell us about things that were going on in the office that were real threats. Some of this is detailed in the Ben Weiser book. He had a camera that he used in the office, and one time he almost got caught with it. And again, we told him to stand down, just to wait until things cooled down, and don't call us, or we won't call you, you call us. And he would eventually come back and say, I think things are better, and we can go on. But this was a relationship that was totally conducted with written messages back and forth and no personal meetings. And that's very tough. A lot of agents just can't handle that. They can't handle the fact that they can't sit down with John or Scotty or Juan every 2 weeks and have a meeting and pour their heart out about what's going on at home or in the office and everything else. And that's the kind of thing that we developed with Kuklinski, and it's kind of like what you would call it, a roadmap for anybody today who might be using some sort of electronic communications on the internet with people. I don't know, but that type of building that type of relationship in writing, so that you get that feedback. You get that feedback so that you know how that person is feeling, so that you can judge when it's time to slow things down.
Thank you. So the relationship eventually comes to an end, and it can end, there are a finite number of ways it can end. Ideally, the asset simply retires from his or her work with CIA in place, and that remains secret. Another outcome, we've talked about exfiltration, actually helping the person escape from a situation. The counterintelligence services are after him. Sometimes we can bring out family members or a dog, apparently. But all too often, more often than we like, the security services catch our asset, and he never makes it out. Scotty Skotzko, you had the very last meeting with a very valuable asset, a Soviet general in military intelligence, Dmitry Polyakov, one of the greats of the Cold War. He retired in place from working with us, but because of a couple of American turncoats, Robert Hansen and Aldrich Ames, the KGB arrested him and he was executed. And so I put the question to all of you, what's it like to lose an asset? I'll start with Scotty, if I could.
Well, you try to separate sentimentality from practicality, but you do have a trust relationship with them. Look, Polyakov was the crown jewel for the CIA on Russian cases for a long time, and was the highest and longest running Soviet case that the agency had. I don't know if he still holds that record or not. But the case ran about 20 years. He first came to this country in 1951. 10 years later, he was in New York. 10 years later, he came back to New York, and he got in contact with an American Army general there, and said, I want to be put in touch with the CIA. Well, the FBI, of course, was all over him. So the FBI accommodated him, pretending that they were CIA. He went back to Moscow. These were in the days when, in 1961, the relationship was not that good between us. He went back to Moscow. He was not really handled there. He came out again, went to Burma. This time the FBI sent one of their special agents out to him to handle him, but quickly found that they couldn't do it because special agent didn't speak any Russian. So after 4 months, he was replaced by a real CIA agent who spoke real Russian. Polyakov provided the identities of a large number of Soviet illegals to us. He also provided information. He exposed a number of American spies that the Russians were running. For instance, Sergeant Jack Dunlap, who was working at the NSA, Lieutenant Colonel Whalen, also working at the NSA, Nelson Drummond, U.S. Navy clerk and radio man, Herbert Beckenhaupt, U.S. Air Force radio man. These all came to us from him. He went back to Moscow and then reappeared again in 1973, came to New Delhi, India. At that time, agency officer named Paul Dillon went out, very good Russian, a lot of experience with handling Soviet cases and block cases. And the way they covered their relationship, maintaining the relationship, was Polyakov got concurrence from Moscow to try to develop Dillon as a potential source. So that meant that Polyakov was able to justify coming and visiting Dillon at his home and having leisurely meetings all that time. He went back and then suddenly, unexpectedly reappeared in Delhi in 1979, which is the point at which I was brought into the operation. That phase of the operation only lasted 9 months. And the relationship between me and Polyakov was entirely different from the relationship that Dillon had. There was no personal dimension, hardly any personal dimension, because we didn't have the time to sit and make nice with each other. My meetings with him were as brief and as secure as possible. Hand him what I needed to hand him, have a brief verbal exchange, get from him the film and the other things that he was providing, and get out of the car and disappear. But nevertheless, we had a good number of meetings under those circumstances. Polyakov, he was a major general at this point in the GRU. Polyakov was never paid. In the 20 years that the case ran, was never paid a salary. There was no account that was set up for him. There were thousands of dollars spent on providing him with sporting equipment and power tools, shotguns, ammunition, all sorts of things like that, fishing equipment, etc. It wasn't for him. Most of that stuff he was taking back home and passing out as gifts to his superiors back in Moscow. That was a common practice, and that was also how you commonly climbed the ladder. So we gave him a lot of stuff, spent a lot of money on stuff for him, but he never took a cent for himself. Second point is, we never really knew, he never really articulated why he did what he was doing. Why did he make himself available to General O'Neill in New York in the first place? We were so busy taking stuff from him, the information he was providing, we were so glad for it, we were so busy processing it, that we never really wanted to sit down and debrief him at length about why are you doing this? He's doing it, thank God you're doing it, we're happy to have it, and that was good enough for us. It wasn't until the very end, the last meeting that I had with him, which was probably the scariest meeting that I ever had with any asset, any time in my 40 years. because he picked me up in his car and he took me into the Soviet residential compound, which is right behind across the street from the Soviet embassy, and into his apartment, which was a first floor apartment. I had to walk from the car into the apartment about 50 feet. And directly overhead, over his apartment, was the KGB deputy resident living. And all I could think was, what the hell am I going to say? How is this going to end if that guy walks out, looks over the balcony and says, oh, who are you bringing in? Introduce me to him. Because the disguise I was wearing was not going to stand up to that kind of close scrutiny. Anyway, I walked in, and much to my surprise, the apartment was empty. His wife had already gone back to Moscow. This was in June. Normally they go back for long R&R in the summer. But here in the middle of the barren apartment in the living room was this pyramid of packages and boxes. His stuff, his household effects had been packed up, standing about 5 feet tall. And I said, oh, what are you doing? He says, well, I got to prepare to go home. I said, well, I thought you were coming back. I thought this was just a vacation. He says, well, one never knows. And I said to him, because I'd had to break I'd had to, the displeasure of having to break to him that his name and his cryptonym had been mentioned in a book that had just come out by David Martin called The Wilderness of Mirrors. David Martin, you'll still see as active and as a reporter in national security affairs. And there was another book, Edward J. Epstein, called Legend. It did much the same thing. And it was clear that there was enough information in there that circumstantially the Soviets could begin a CI investigation. So I said to him, as we're standing in the apartment, I said, you know, if you think you're in difficulty, you certainly have more than paid your way for us for 20 years. We owe you. We'll get you out of here and take you there. And the first time that I ever saw him react in a very hostile, negative way. It was the first time, none of his previous several handlers had seen that before. He said, I'm not doing this for you. I'm not doing this for your country. I don't intend to be an American. I'm not going to America to die. I was born a Russian. I will die a Russian. I will die in Russia. I'm doing this because of those bastards. He was pointing to Moscow. So in other words, his motivation and the common ground that we shared, getting back to that concept, the common ground that we were sharing all these years had to do with his interest in doing something to weaken the corrupt communist government in Moscow. It wasn't necessarily because of anything they had done to him. He was leading a good life. He was a war hero.
I'd like to go first on the regret so that we don't end on a negative note and someone else can pick it up. Okay. And I think the reason I'm going to mention it is because I feel strongly about it and because I think that it's a situation we still haven't been able to remedy fully. And it has happened to us many times. We're a very skilled organization, very committed officers. And everything we do with all our effort, might, interest. And so we end up doing a pretty good job, whether you go back to Southeast Asia and Vietnam or other examples around the world in Africa and North Africa and Latin America and such. And so my own regret is, and I think we're poised to repeat it, because my own regret is working with really dedicated individuals on a common goal and putting everything into it and then finding yourself with either a change in policy or some other aspect that leads you to walk away from that. And these individuals are often left alone or abandoned or defend for themselves, and while that was our job, right, it certainly doesn't feel good. And these are people, we always manage to take the upper echelon, and resettle them either in the U.S. and other places, but for the most part, some of these stories can end really poorly, and whether you talk about a situation like the one that impacts me, I've been working with the Nicaraguan Contras, was after the peace treaty, the Sandinista government, with help of Cuban Soviet and Soviet advisors, methodically went about assassinating a number of the mid-level and senior members of the Contras during the peacetime, so that there could never be a resurgence of any kind of that type of activity. And that was the largest peasant army that's ever existed in this hemisphere, 22,000 combatants, supported, funded, and financed in partnership with us. And to just walk away from a situation like that, that's a regret I have.
Yeah, I follow on to something you said. On my first tour, I was in Laos. It was a very short tour. I was there 9 months before we were all kicked out. And that was in May 1975. And it was a good lesson to me as a first tour case officer. The chief called us all together, and we all sitting around the table. He said, not one of you is going to leave this country until every one of our agents, past and present, has been offered the opportunity to leave. And for the next couple of weeks, as things got worse, we spent time with our agents who we were seeing were active, seeing if they wanted to leave. And if they did, we found a way to get them out. And for those even old agents, we tried to find them. And the only bona fides you could say was having the name of their former case officer. And you try to find a house in Asia, probably the same in Africa. There are no addresses. It's the fourth house from the corner where there's a noodle stand or something, and you're going there in the night, knocking on doors, and people looking at you and wondering who you were, and it was very trying time. One day at noon, I was asked by the chief of support, I said, can you drive a truck? I said, sure, what do you want me to do? He said, take that 16-foot van out there and go out to the motel on the way to the airport and blow the horn, and these people will come out. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. Pulled into this place, blew the horn, and 40 people, men, women, and children, came out of one of the rooms in this old-fashioned Air America motel. Came out and hopped in the back of this 16-foot van, and I drove them out to the airport and drove them onto the tarmac and backed up to one of our planes that was sitting there from Udorn, engines running, and people jumped off the plane and jumped off the truck and into the plane, and I drove away and the plane took off. I had an agent who stayed in my house with his 3 kids for several days before we could figure out a way to get him out of the country, get him across the river to Thailand. And one night I can remember that the night was just filled with the engines of piston-engined airplanes flying overhead. And we found out the next day that what they were the aircraft that had gone up to the Plain de Jar and were flying out all the Hmong tribesmen that were up there. And they were all taken out and resettled in the United States. And that was, to me, was a good lesson in standing up for the people who have taken the risk to give us all the information and to help us. And it's something that worked very well with me as I worked in Soviet and East European cases for the next 20 years after that.
Thank you. Last word to John Bennett.
The highlights in my career, which, like my colleagues here, spans the Cold War and then post 9/11, the war in terror. 2 highlights: the wall coming down, and then the killing of Osama bin Laden. The sad melancholy for me is not about agents. When I think back over my career, starting with the bombing in Lebanon and in Beirut in '83, where I had colleagues, one of my first mentors, killed, and then the East Africa bombings when I was deputy division chief, and we lost people in Angola when I was working on that program. And then later, when I was chief of Special Activities Division, I lost several paramilitary officers in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then when I was the DDO, we lost officers in Khost in the bombing there, and then later in Benghazi, and still some more in Afghanistan. So, the memorial wall at headquarters, a lot of those stars on the wall were people who either worked for me or who I knew personally. And we do have a memorial there to the fallen agents, which is really for the foreign nationals who work for us. But sometimes we don't focus enough on our own people who've paid the ultimate sacrifice. And we have certainly, since 9/11, taken a number of casualties proportional to the size of our service and when compared to the military. And I will never forget those people. It never gets any easier. I lost officers from my station in Islamabad when they bombed the Marriott there. So at every phase of my career, I've lost colleagues along the way, and you just never forget them, and it never gets easier.
Well, this has been an illuminating conversation, and I thank everyone for coming. I thank our panelists.